Hello and welcome to another episode of Nothing Ventured with me, Aarish Shah. Today in the studio with me, I have Henry Joseph Grant. Henry is an entrepreneur and mentor with over 2 decades of experience scaling startups and driving innovation across industries. As a key figure in the growth of iconic brands like Just Eat, which he helped transform from startup to its $2.44 billion IPO, and The Entertainer, which achieved a $100 million exit, Henry has proven his expertise in building market-leading businesses. Currently, he serves as entrepreneur in residence at Web Summit, the world's leading technology event. In today's episode, we talk about leveraging the iPhone to launch an entirely new business category with Just Eat.
So the iPhone had recently just launched.
Lobbing pizzas over the fence at freshers' fairs, doing things that don't scale.
When you get to the university, can you throw it over the 7-foot wall at the freshers' fair?
How comfort, convenience, and choice in tech always come at a cost, and how when you ask for money, you get advice. When you ask for advice, you get money.
It's that classic thing, ask for advice, you get money. Ask for money, you get advice.
Is product-led growth really just buying traction? And how you need to make cuts when you need them, but make them once and make them the right way.
If you look at other companies, obviously they're trigger happy. They make cuts even when they don't need to.
How Henry has created a business out of the most heartbreaking experience in his life, and how Web Summit cross-pollinates companies from startups to Fortune 500.
Cross-pollinate between Fortune 500 companies, executives from there, decision makers from there, more importantly, investors.
Whether the West is going through managed decline, and whether venture should be seen as the allegory of the cave.
Obviously, for me, the allegory of the cave is alive and kicking.
The distribution of capital is never going to be fair.
The distribution of capital is never going to be fair.
Yep.
It's never going to be fair. Obviously, there's going to be a disparity in terms of who receives VC.
And Henry's contrarian opinion, intelligence is nothing without consciousness. Too many people don't think about what they're saying. Let's get straight into it.
Right, I think a lot of people are operating at very low levels of consciousness. They assume they're thinking, but they're not.
Hey, whilst I've got you there for a second, I just thought I'd introduce myself. My name's Aarish. I'm the host of Nothing Ventured, the podcast where I talk to the people behind the stories that make the venture ecosystem go round. I'm also the founder of Emerge One, a consultancy providing fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups from seed to Series B and beyond. If you love the podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you like, rate, and subscribe wherever you listen. And if you have anything to say to me and want to give me some advice on who I should get on next and what topics to talk about, connect with me on LinkedIn or on Twitter and let me know your thoughts. Right, back to the pod. Henry, welcome to the studio. Real pleasure to have you here with me today.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay, well, look, before we get into the main podcast, I do have a bit of a cheeky question, right? So a week or so ago on LinkedIn, you mentioned that you hadn't really been on a podcast since the early or the late 2000s, I guess, and that was the early days of Harry Stebbing's podcast, 20VC. So just to ask you the question, what are you doing here now?
So the reason why I decline a lot of the invites for podcasts is I feel like I'm getting started. I've got a 1% mentality, so I feel like there's always 99% more that you could do.
Yeah.
And also, to be honest with you, a lot of the podcasts I don't really watch. So obviously, to appear on them will be a bit fake, really, to go on one of them. I watch yours avidly, so I'm impressed with what you guys are doing, and it's well produced. So obviously, here I am.
Well, thank you very much for that endorsement. That will be going out all over our socials pretty shortly. So look, let's get straight into some of the meatier topics that we have to talk about, right? So let's talk about Just Eat. You were one of the first UK employees at Just Eat, ultimately as regional manager in the UK, leaving shortly before its $2.4 billion IPO. No one was really talking about or even taking a punt on food delivery back in the early, late 2000s. And Index Ventures only invested in Just Eat Series A in mid-2009. So what did you see as that step change that led to the appetite, pun very much intended, for this sort of a service? And looking back at that time, what were the sort of challenges you faced essentially launching an entirely new product service category in the UK?
Okay, so in terms of the potential back then, at the time, the only company that was doing online delivery was Domino's Pizza.
Yeah.
And they had the market to themselves, right? So you couldn't order pizza. So you could order pizza, but you couldn't order Chinese or Indian takeaway or whatever it may be. And obviously there was a lot of combination of factors which were in our favor. So the iPhone had recently just launched. Obviously smartphones were becoming more of a kind of thing at scale. Also on top of that, the recession was actually good for Just Eat, obviously in terms of the likelihood that people wouldn't go out and spend £100 on a meal with their wife on a Tuesday evening, but they would get a pizza because they still need to eat, really. So basically, those combination of factors kind of align with most special companies. If you look at what Phil Libin says, the founder of Evernote, who went into VC afterwards, that you get the special companies emerge, sort of when there's a slowdown in venture capital and there's an increase in actual focus on companies that are actually going to do something rather than
resilience plus profitability is an incredible thing.
Pretty much, and that was the kind of the thing with Just Eat is we didn't actually need VC, obviously to get going. One of the things that we did early days was actually we charged the restaurants to come onto the platform. And when I told this to people, they're like, "How the hell did you get that money from them?" And literally, we would rock up to a takeaway and ask them for £700 cash in person on the spot. And obviously, that wasn't easy because obviously, people that own restaurants are quite interesting characters. And obviously, we essentially funded ourselves through actually taking that money from the restaurants, which kind of presented a challenge because we didn't have any orders, right? So we had to get £700 from a takeaway to join the platform.
Yeah, we're promising you will get orders, but you need to give us some money first.
Pretty much. And look, I mean, obviously, in terms of how we did get those orders, obviously the student market was very good for us in the early days. We actually did a lot of promotion at Freshers Fairs, etc. I don't know if you've obviously remember the days when you was at uni with Freshers Fairs and stuff, but basically to exhibit at Freshers Fair is a bit of a mafioso because you have to actually pay the university a fee to actually exhibit there. Yeah. And again, Domino's being quite vertically integrated into the whole of the kind of student world, actually usually has exclusivity on hot food, so you can't get into the Freshers Fairs.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, like I was at university in 97 through 2001. I didn't really go to the Freshers Fairs that much, but Domino's was like the predominant kind of like that was where all the flyers were coming from. It was the most heavily marketed kind of food delivery.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so they would actually pay a fee to be exclusive, so they couldn't actually get anyone else that was going to compete with them to exhibit. Yeah. Not at all universities, but quite a few. And we did very Machiavellian kind of stuff really, where we'd actually go and join the gym within the grounds of the university so we could get onto the campus. And I remember vividly at one university in particular in my early days, actually going and basically throwing some T-shirts over the actual wall of the Freshers Fair, going and finding an obsolete stand in the Freshers Fair that wasn't actually taken and putting them over to look like it was actually a stand that was meant to be there, calling one of our restaurants, again, who'd paid £700 to join Just Eat and not got any orders, and said, I need 20 16-inch pieces to the university. He's like, oh, great, we've got an order, but I thought it comes through the machine. No, this is for me. Okay, how much are you gonna pay me? Nothing. Okay, and when you get to the university, can you throw it over the 7-foot wall at the Freshers Fair? Dude, this sounds like a complete waste of time. Like, what am I doing here? Yeah. And the hilarious thing was on that actual specific one, he actually came and did it, but at the wrong part of the Freshers Fair. So
just lobbed a bunch of pizzas over.
Well, I was on the phone to him and I was like, Shaq, where are these pizzas? And he was like, I'm throwing them over right now. And I've taped them all up so they're not going to come out. I was like, okay. And I actually thought, oh my God, he's throwing it on the side where the security is. And I literally walked around to the actual front of the Freshers Fair and it was quite surreal to see pizzas literally flying through the air. Everybody was just jaw dropped, like, what the hell is going on here? And the security guy, remember, I wasn't meant to be there either. So the security guy was like, what's going on? And I was like, you can't get the delivery drivers these days. So I literally went in there and we got something like 1,500 email addresses, obviously from the students. Yeah. I remember a few years later when we actually closed our Series A, actually getting a company to go in and do that officially and pay our way into there and got less email addresses than what I got.
Well, this is the epitome of that, like, kind of boring but very true phrase, like do things that don't scale, right? Like, I mean, I think so many startups, shy away from flyer dropping, from physical kind of interaction. They want to do everything digitally, everything online. But I always think about it, people buy from people. Like if you're in front of a person, you can create emotion with them. If you can create kind of some sort of excitement, like some sort of experience, they're going to remember you, right?
You need to know your market. Yeah. And the only way you're going to know your market is by getting out there and being in the market. Yeah. With Just Eat, it's a three-sided market-place. Obviously we've got the customers on one side, but also the restaurants on the other side. Without us actually connecting those both, we're nothing, essentially. So another thing what I did at Just Eat was basically what you find with the UK takeaway market is it's very nationality based. So you get a critical mass of restaurants from a Bangladesh background, Pakistan background, a Libyan background, depends on where you are in the UK. And these are kind of ecosystems within themselves within the industry. So, the Bangladeshi guy will go to the Bangladeshi fish supplier, the Bangladeshi accountant, etc. And also even within those communities, the ecosystems as well, because they're not always together, right? So sometimes you have two accountants that serve each other, right? So one of the things that I got my teams to do was actually go and partner with the accountants within those communities and get them to be the salesperson for them, right? So rather than you you going and knocking on doors, obviously all day long trying to get this money, go and get the accountant to actually tap up the best restaurants. And then you've obviously got the intelligence, obviously, from those guys. So there's a lot of stuff that, as you said, it's not scalable that you can do, but there's a lot of stuff that is scalable and actually saves you a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, the point about doing the things that don't scale first is that you learn what does scale, as part of that process, right? You figure it out as you're going along. I think, the interesting thing for me is that, Just Eat was a completely new category, right? Like it blows my mind when I think about, the ubiquity of Deliveroo, Uber Eats, everything else that we have these days, takeaway.com obviously now, as was Just Eats. I mean, the reality is that we've gotten so used to it in the same way we've gotten used to the Uber and everything else, Facebook, Google, Twitter, etc., X, whatever you want to call it. Like these things, when I was at university, did not exist. And actually, at the time that they launched here in the UK, I was out of the country. So I only really saw them when I came back, and it was just a step change in the way things were done. Yeah. It was a really exciting time. I mean, you left a couple of years or a year and a half, I think, just before the IPO. Yeah. Was that intentional? Had you run your course, or what was the?
So it was interesting. So basically, I'd reached a ceiling within the business. What you kind of find when you're heading towards an IPO is that you get a lot of logo hires. Yeah. So people that's going to look good on the IPO prospectus. Got it. Also just kind of give you a bit of juice, really. So a lot of people don't actually know a lot about the story of Just Eat, but the founder Jesper Busch, he's a Danish guy. He's now on Lovensfjord, which is the Lions Pit, which is like Dragon's Den in Denmark. He's like Elon Musk in Denmark, he's huge there, but not a lot of people know the story of Just Eat in the UK in terms of the Danish background, etc. So basically, when he actually came to the UK to set up Just Eat, it had been around for about a year or two, just before I joined in 2008. Basically, he hired a CEO from Denmark who was actually ex-McKinsey. Yeah. And classical McKinsey style, he was trying to push Jesper out straight away of the business. And basically, there was a battle within Just Eat in terms of the leadership team, in terms of that. It wasn't so much, it was, he was trying to fire him, but it was just basically a difference of opinion, right? So Jesper's obviously way of doing things was different from what Klaus wanted to do, et cetera, et cetera. And it created kind of like a two-camp sort of situation within the business. I was quite far removed from that because I don't really get into politics in terms of physically or in terms of emotionally, so I try and stay out of it. So I was actually one of the longest serving people in the company. I'd been around for 4 years, and Klaus's kind of take was that you didn't have entrepreneurs in a business that was scaling. Yeah. I completely disagreed with that, because obviously if you don't have entrepreneurs in a business, you're never going to innovate and kind of stay relevant. And obviously the great learning from that was there's two different styles there, right? So Jesper was very much founderitis, right? He was literally like, it's his baby. Great entrepreneur. I mean, obviously a lot of the success I've had so far in my career was actually definitely down to him in terms of infecting me with his DNA. Klaus was much more process driven, frameworks, etc. as well. So there's two contrasting styles there. And also another mention as well, David Buttress, who became the CEO later as well. Who's renowned in the city now, is obviously CEO of an energy company, etc. as well. So we had some fantastic characters within the business. And in terms of your point around creating a step change in an industry that didn't exist before, it was super hard. Obviously when we were educating restaurants, obviously this was the future back in 2008. They didn't believe us. Quite simply. Obviously they was actually making 5 or 6K a week. Obviously they didn't really want to make any more than that, because if they did, taxation, etc. was a bit of a tricky kind of question and objection from them as well. So we had to kind of basically manage that in terms of educating people on the partner side in terms of what the future would be for the industry that they've been in for many years and they didn't actually see any change coming to. And then also on the actual consumer side. Now with the consumer side, I think it was a bit easier. Had the smartphone not came out, it would have been a lot harder, because obviously I don't think people would have booted up a tower PC to go and order pizza. Obviously it would have created more friction. But in terms of what we did, I think we was very good at obviously owning the marketplace. And what a lot of the venture capital investors would say is that obviously we was an online business, but with offline tentacles. Yeah, sure. So we own the high street. Obviously in terms of competitors, I mean, I can touch on a few stories, but we had competitors around the UK that obviously replicated Just Eat and tried to beat us. They'd basically go and do a blitz with several cities around the UK where they actually send out our sales teams, invest heavily to go and actually sign up loads of restaurants. And I would let them do that with the teams. And then as soon as they went online, I'd call the restaurants individually and say, look, look, if you don't take that competitor off the website, sorry, your restaurant off that competitor's website, I'm going to take you off Just Eat.
Yeah.
And it was quite brutal. And obviously, you know, we had to literally own, you know, the distribution obviously for Just Eat, and you know, we was quite intense in how we did that. Obviously, we wanted to keep obviously the leverage and obviously be the best platform out there.
Well, I mean, look, I want to move on from Just Eat in a second, but like, there's 2 or 3 things that come to mind. I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, you don't want to be side by side with your competitors, right? On the restaurants, you know, whether it's their website or whether it's in their store. So that just seems to me to be, you know, I wouldn't necessarily call it good business practice, but it is business, right? Like, that's where you got to look at it, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, to your point, distribution is everything.
Yeah.
And if you are having people eating into that distribution, then the answer to that is, well, look, we have the best network. If you don't want to be part of the best network, then that's your choice. Go with the competitors, but you may well suffer, right?
Yeah.
So that's one way of looking at it. I think the other thing that, you know, just as you were talking, that very much comes to mind is that whole education piece. Like, same with Uber, same with Airbnb, right? And your point around digital with offline tentacles. That's exactly what those businesses are. And it's part of what's made them so sticky is because they have both the online and the offline presence. I think the final thing I would say is, you know, let's face it, in 2020, had we have not had platforms like Just Eat, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, etc., that would have been a whole different experience for most people, right? Like, I mean, I think, you know, I don't remember how often we got takeaway during that period, but I would bet that it was a hell of a lot more than we do today, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think people's lives have been changed for the better, which is not something you'd necessarily think about when you think about a delivery platform, right? Like how substantially that changed the way that we do things and we think about socializing, we think about the way we do things. I'm like, to be honest, I still remember the Just, like, you know, over recent years, I've seen Just Eat ads. They're the ones that stick in my mind because it is about people gathering together and, you know, chilling at home, getting a bit of takeaway and having a good time. And especially, I guess, you know, at the moment we're going through various costs of living crises on top of everything else. Like, it's just a really good way for people to be able to feel like, you know, they've got something happening in their lives that is fun, that's pleasant, that is, you know, outside of the mundane. So
I think it's changed, though. I think it's changed.
Really?
I actually think my whole outlook, I don't want to criticize Just Eat because obviously I'm a Just Eat through and through in my DNA. But I mean, obviously Just Eat wasn't the first mover in the UK. Hungry House was. So they went on Dragon's Den and they actually raised some money. And a lot of people don't realize with Dragon's Den that obviously when you get money on Dragon's Den, it goes through due diligence afterwards, and you may not get the money. And they got basically torn to shreds because there was a company that was 6 months less in the UK and obviously done 10 times more execution, I think it said, and that was us. And basically, so I think in the early days, definitely when the likes of Just Eat and Hungry House was in the UK, it was just symbiotic. You know,
you know what? Now that you mention Hungry House, I kind of remember them, but I don't really.
Yeah, there was basically, I mean, I'm an Arsenal fan. They was Tottenham, we was Arsenal, right? So we always won more, but you know, they was obviously a good competitor and they kept us on our toes. You know, obviously we used to take the competition piece very, very, very seriously. So we used to take pleasure in pulling their stickers down out of windows and stuff like that. But what you realize as you move through the actual industry is obviously that you need dancing partners. You need to actually have, you know, good competitors that actually make you push yourselves and obviously make sure you're the best. But in terms of how the industry's evolved, you know, obviously I think it's changed from that where we used to charge like 10% commission to the restaurants.
Sure.
You know, I have restaurants to this day phoning me that obviously I know from those days at Just Eat, and they're now getting charged, you know, upwards of up to 50% on an order and stuff as well. So it can get very, very expensive and the economics just don't stack up no more, right? So I think the challenge for the actual delivery platforms these days is to stay relevant because I definitely think there's going to be an emergence of other platforms that actually take what Just Eat and Uber Eats and Deliveroo, etc. have done and take it to the next level. So
well, the obvious next level, or the one that was always coming, was the dark kitchens, right? Like which already exists. But I think when you get to the point where you've got a dark kitchen that can service any type of food order, you know, any type of cuisine, and it's centralized, your costs suddenly start plummeting. You've got control over the whole chain, the whole value chain, but equally, you've got a central point of pickup, delivery, et cetera, et cetera. It just makes everything more efficient. So I can definitely see that potentially coming. And of course, again, during the pandemic, we saw lots of restaurants shutter because like the hospitality industry.
They're dropping
was
like
hit.
flies at the minute. I mean, the actual economics for having a physical restaurant doesn't work out anymore, right? Unless you're a very, very, very busy restaurant that obviously has, control over its margins. I definitely agree that the dark kitchens is a natural evolution, but I don't think it's going to be, the only evolution. I think there's going to be a lot of innovation in the space as well.
Yeah, well, let's see. I want to move on because I think we've got a ton of stuff that I really want to talk about as well. So, you've been involved in a lot of different industries. That's everything from launching a discount platform to scaling B2B travel tech with Talixo and much more, either, in operational advisory, mentorship, or even leadership and co-founding roles. So what is it that fuels your curiosity, and how do you think about these businesses in terms of where you want to place your bets?
Yeah, and in terms of where I want to place my bets, I'm not too choosy in the space. As you can see, I've moved around a lot in my career, completely different industries that I had no experience in before that as well. So what I'm very good at is actually acclimatizing in the industry very quickly, essentially becoming an expert in the industry and getting, the network and also credibility within the industry to do whatever I want. That's a natural evolution for me to go from industry to industry. In terms of, how that aligns with me personally is changing as I get older and mature and become more conscious as a person. You mentioned before, obviously, the greatness of having a delivery platform. I actually look at it a little bit different. I think it's not that special, really, to have a pizza delivery platform that obviously, or not pizza only, but takeaway delivery food platform is not really changing the world, essentially. And especially when it's cannibalizing an industry as well, because I think as these platforms mature, the likes of Uber, etc., they do a good job for the consumer. But if you get in an Uber today, they're going to basically say, "Oh well, I'm not making a lot of money from this ride, etc." And kind of hint to
we cannot get Ubers from our apartment because no one wants to come there because it's just too far out.
Yeah, I think it's obviously an interesting time in the world because obviously driverless cars are coming. There won't be any drivers soon. So I think the interesting thing is with these marketplaces especially is that they have a lot of cool features in terms of comfort and convenience and choice, but there's always at a cost. And I think where I'm getting to in business now is that I'm conscious of those kind of impacts as well. And it's all very well owning an industry, but you really want to add value to it and constantly innovate in that industry as well. And I don't think the best businesses take away all the time and not add back. And I feel don't get me wrong. The likes of Uber, Just Eat, all of these kind of companies, they do great things, but I just feel that there's actually space there to do symbiotic things with the world as well, rather than just basically extract value and money.
Yeah, I had a long conversation with our last guest, Jeff Cruzy, about certainly here in the UK the kind of rent-taking mentality that we have, which a lot of these platforms are extractive rather than additive, right? So they find loopholes, I guess, is the best way of putting it, and figure out how to extract rent from those rather than necessarily creating new value, right? Now, you could argue that something like Airbnb has created new value because it's essentially released, lots of lazy assets. So people who had homes that, had spare rooms or second homes, right? Which, arguably are already rent-seeking activities in any case, right? But it basically, allowed all of these lazy assets suddenly become productive, quote unquote, right? But at the end of the day, Airbnb in and of itself hasn't created something new, right? It's created something new in terms of the experience of the marketplace, but hasn't built a new platform which essentially changes the way people think about or do. I guess arguably they have changed the way we think about travel and how we maybe execute on a travel, but I guess they haven't created something that has added something net new to the world.
I think they've added a channel for travel, essentially, right? In terms of the collateral damage, obviously you could argue that the rent prices have increased because of Airbnbs, etc.
Well, Barcelona has basically banned it, right? Now, at this point, because it's pushed rent so high that the local population, can't afford to live in the city, right?
And I think, look, obviously you can't keep everyone happy. There's going to be some sort of downsides to any business, especially at scale. But I just feel that, for me, where I'm at in my career, especially, is I don't want to look back at my career and think, okay, in terms of monetary value, it's basically, okay, what impact did that have on the world, obviously, and did it make people's lives better? Yeah,
it's always, I think about it in terms of legacy, right? Like, what is the mark that you want to leave on the world? How do you want to be talked about when you're gone, right? Now, not, you don't necessarily want to be talked about when you're gone, but, the way I think about it is, when my kids, when their kids, when those around me, talk about me, how do I want to be remembered? And I want to be I personally want to be remembered for having, done something that was meaningful in my life, that had some impact on the world or some impact on the industry that I'm working in or whatever it is, rather than just going out and, earning money to survive or I love traveling, but I wouldn't consider my purpose in life as how do I make enough money that I can travel more or certainly not buy more stuff. I'm not material in any way, shape or form. Right. But I think one of the problems we face in the world today, and we're seeing it more and more with the oligarchs and some of the rhetoric around, millionaires leaving the UK, et cetera, is that everything is being framed as, monetary value is the only value.
Yeah.
I just don't see it like that.
But money's an illusion, right? I mean, obviously, I think you're touching on basic freedom is what you look at in terms of what's your purpose. Legacy, I look at a little bit different. I don't care if I'm remembered at all. What I really care about is more knowing that I emptied myself while I was here.
Amazing.
In terms of, giving as much as I can. And obviously, that to me, legacy is more of a real-time thing than actually a retrospective thing in terms of what I was done and remembered for by other people. I think it's within, not without. And I think that's where a lot of people get lost. I think a lot of people think, okay, how can I have this, kind of perfect image where I've got no vulnerabilities and no mistakes and stuff as well. Life doesn't work like that. It's real.
I completely take what you're saying on board. I think so much of it can be driven by ego, and I'm big enough and old enough to recognize where mine is coming through. But the only way, I guess the way I think about it maybe is the only way you can have that legacy in terms of when you're gone is by doing stuff whilst you're here, right? So you still got to do the stuff whilst you're here, of course, irrespective, right? But so talking a bit more about, more specifically about some of the companies that you've been involved with since your time at Just Eat, right? So you joined mobility startup Talixo, which was a Series A funded startup, as the chief commercial officer in 2018. So as an example, just to understand kind of how you made these decisions, what was it that attracted you to move and relocate to Berlin to join the company? And can you talk us through where it was at that point and how the journey unfolded?
Yeah, great. So I basically, I always seek the opinion of other people that I respect before I make a move. So I actually have got a sort of an informal mentor of mine who's arguably the top VC in Europe by far. So basically, I sat down and had a conversation with him about what I should do. I had a few ideas for a startup at the time, and primarily it was actually a conversation to get investment from him, basically. Why I had that conversation, it's that classic thing, ask for advice, you get money. Ask for money, you get advice. But also I was appreciating the advice. I wanted to know obviously what his opinions were, because he'd been an operator and an entrepreneur and an investor as well. So obviously he kind of sat in all seats. And he basically said to me that, you've got a fantastic, track record in terms of what you did with Just Eat, but I believe you need more C-level experience. And I think you need what you need to do is you need to go and join a Series A funded startup with a tier one investor that's obviously going to give you equity, and you can create some wealth and also get the experience. And I was like, I don't know who contacts you to the person, obviously, but I don't get those kind of messages, obviously, to go and join like a runaway rocket ship at Series A. Obviously, here's some equity. And he goes, well, that's fine. We'll go to a tier two. Obviously, go to somebody. Go and do the same thing that I'm explaining to you do, but with a slightly less sexy startup. There's no shame in that. And I was like, okay, interesting, because I do get those kind of messages to go and join those companies. So basically, I was headhunted for the role at Talixo, which had raised Series A. They'd raised a sort of around €7 million Series A. In total, they'd raised about 12.5 million. Done a fantastic job. An amazing founder who was actually ex-BCG. I tend to not normally rate consultants in terms of being in startups, because I think they're all kind of tourists. Obviously just coming for the fun of it while there's 0% interest rates. But he was actually the exception. He was completely dedicated to his startup. He was actually traveling when he was at BCG, realized the actual airport transfer piece was not being actually completed by the likes of Uber, etc. And he basically was typical German. He wanted to make it efficient and obviously try and solve that. What Talixo didn't have was actually somebody who was a commercial leader. So they had partnerships,
which by the way is like often the case in these sort of, because obviously they're often founder led for a long period of time, but they don't have, the founder, whilst they do amazing jobs of getting the business from 0 to 1, it's how do you get it from 1 to many, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in terms of your point, I mean, they was classic to that. You know, obviously they had obviously a great leadership team, but obviously the missing piece was actually commercial. In my experience, commercial was an afterthought in most startups, even very, very well backed venture capital funded VC funded startups. And I think that's because basically there's been this illusion that product led growth is the only way. And I think that's a bit of bullshit. I think obviously people who claim product-led growth are talking shit. You know, it's basically they buy traction and they say it's because of the product. And for me, you know, the reality is you need to roll up your sleeves as a leadership team and lead from the front. And that was kind of the missing piece at Talixo. So when I joined, we had some great partnerships with the likes of Booking.com, and a few others, but there was not very, very deep in the relationship. Yeah. So obviously we was one of many suppliers for them for airport transfers. I basically came on board with two remits, basically to completely overhaul the whole sales strategy and partnership strategy, and then also to basically ensure that we had diversity in our bookings. So obviously we could actually create justification of valuation to go on to a Series B. So we didn't have the numbers to get to Series B, quite frankly. So I was kind of a roll of the dice for them essentially, because our burn was really high. I think it was doing 500k net burn per month. Yeah. So you know there wasn't a lot of time to be playing with really. So I needed to do something
even fast. If you still had 7 million in the bank at that time, that's 14 months.
Yeah, I mean, it was doing quite good revenue, but obviously, again, it wasn't at a point where all of the boxes that were ticked at a Series B would be ticked. So, you know, when you speak to growth funds, obviously it's all about numbers, right? And obviously diversified partners, etc. So I came on board. We brought on the likes of Expedia, C-Trip, which is the Expedia of China, Despegar, which is like the Expedia of South America, etc. We brought on board major airlines. We also brought on board NetJets, which is a Berkshire Hathaway company. You know, we had competitors in the space. Have you had a Black Lane in Germany? So they basically owned the relationship with NetJets, and
they're predominantly a limo service, no?
Yeah, I mean they're quite bougie. They try and basically position themselves as kind of the sexier part of the market, but that's a very small part of the market. The major part of the market is the kind of mass corporate travel, at a certain level. So basically, like the NetJets relationship was a very complex RFP that would basically went over, I think, 5 or 6 months. It was quite a challenging one, because obviously, Talixo operates in over 1,000 markets globally. So, that's over 1,000 cities, 135 countries. Pricing alone is a huge challenge, obviously, to be able to give dynamic pricing to any partner, but also an unscheduled airline that's going from location to location where they don't normally have operations is even more challenging. So, things like that was a classic example. Now, those partnerships meant we scaled up to about 30 million revenue, ARR. And we went back to go out to VCs to actually raise the VC funding. And what was really funny was they basically said, it's not quite sexy enough for us at the moment. Airport transfers are not really the space that we're looking at. Uber's kind of, and it's just a classic example where these guys don't really know what they're talking about, right? Yeah. They because they're all chasing Talixo now because they've got revenue, right? But obviously in those days before 2020, obviously it was a different story. So we basically got it on point to profitability. So we went from 500k burn to near enough profitability, and then the COVID pandemic struck. Overnight we went from
travel
decimated. I mean, we went 80% less overnight, basically. So we went back up to around about 500k burn. I was just about to leave Talixo at the time, so obviously I had to then stay for another year, more than I attended, and basically stabilize the company, which we did. It was very brutal. We had to obviously make a lot of job cuts. We went from about 120 people down to about 35 to 40. We had to take 50% pay cuts, etc. as well, and obviously we had to absorb that the most in the management team as well. So it was very tricky times, but we actually stabilized the company and raised more investment from our existing investors. So it was a great experience. And then Talixo today is in a very, very healthy position. The travel industry is back now. Obviously I've got a vested interest, obviously, for that to do well. But obviously, I'm just happy to see them fantastically thriving as well.
I mean, I think it's an amazing story. And as we learned during the pandemic, so many businesses obviously failed during that period, right? But the ones that were sharp, resilient, understood what they needed to do, and executed really quickly are the ones that probably are surviving and thriving today. I mean, it would be remiss of me as the CFO in the room, as the finance guy, not to say, how difficult it is to convince founders to do things like make redundancies, reduce costs, reduce salaries. I've been in companies where founders are loath, even though they may be running down to their last 1-2 months of runway, to even signal to the company that they may need to make those sort of cuts, which obviously, and I think one of the interesting things for me is like, obviously it's critical to do those in time because it takes time to bed those sort of cuts in, right? Like day one, you make a cut, doesn't mean that cost sort of flows out of the business immediately. It may take 2 or 3 months for that to happen, right? But more importantly, and I think this is a really important thing, is you want to give your employees some sort of security about their jobs, right? So in a situation where travel has basically disappeared overnight, clearly these employees are going to have concerns about what that means for their jobs, etc. It is better not, like in my opinion, it is much better to allow an employee to figure out what their next move is rather than keep them strung along and then essentially, ultimately make them redundant or have something happen. So I always applaud. I mean, like, it's the unsexy reality of running a business. And I have massive respect for founders and leadership teams that actually do those sort of things in the right way, because I've seen it not done in the right way far too many times, and it is awful.
Yeah, really, I mean, the actual pandemic was uncharted waters for most people, right? Obviously, in terms of the cuts. I mean, we had to, essentially make 2/3 of the company, well, even actually more than that, redundant, obviously, overnight. And, the real sad thing about that is obviously everyone was doing a good job. Obviously the actual changes that actually needed to be made in terms of performance had all been made already. So it was a case of like, who do we let go? Obviously, and I actually spoke to one of the founders that I actually go to for advice, and he basically said, look, if you're going to do it, you have to do the cuts once. Because if you do it twice, everyone that remains is going to basically spend every part of their day looking for a new job.
Cut once, cut deeply, and then move forward. 100%. I actually was mentoring someone recently, sort of last year, was going through exactly this. The founder really didn't want to make these cuts, and basically what I said to this person was like, no, you need to tell the founder, this is not about dribs and drabs and kind of drip feeding these cuts in. No, make the cut, make them deep, make them, meaningful. And then, make sure that everyone else who's there understands that, okay, we got to roll up our sleeves and now make this work. And we're in it for the long haul. Exactly to your point. If you make the cut and there's even, a scintilla of a thought that there are further cuts coming, everyone's checked out.
I think there's also a difference of opinion of how to make the cuts as well. So when I was at Talixo, Seb, a CEO and founder, he basically wanted to kind of leave the company in a position where we could scale back up. My take is we may never get to that point, so we need to be even more brutal to do it all in one go. If you look at Web Summit, where I'm currently entrepreneur in residence, they didn't make any cuts. So they basically absorbed, obviously, the events industry obviously basically closed down as well, right? Obviously went online, etc. So they lost a lot of money by actually keeping every single member of the team, because they had a dream team, right? So obviously they didn't want to let anyone go.
But they could afford to do that as well.
They could afford to do it,
right?
But obviously I think, I've never, I'm going to say I've been with the company a short period of time now, but I've never been in a company where the loyalty and, the optimism and the commitment is such a high level. And I think that's testament, because he did do stuff like that. Obviously, if you look at other companies, obviously they're trigger happy, they make cuts even when they don't need to. So I think there's no real right or wrong way to do it. You need to work out what's best for the business. But the optics of that are always going to be very challenging for you to handle. And I don't think a lot of people necessarily realize the actual hard part of cuts is not actually the cuts, it's the internal comms after the cuts.
Oh yeah, 100%. Well, it's the pre-comms, it's the comms during, and it's the comms after. And this is why there's a whole industry around change management and communication. I want to move on a second as well, because I mean, this is, I mean, when we talked about this, it really really touched something. Like, more recently you founded a business called Sendoff, right? Which was to bring some really badly needed innovation to the end of life industry. And this was after the passing of your son. So, I mean, I can't even begin to think of that myself, right? But how challenging was it to turn such an incredibly heartbreaking experience into something that at least has a semblance of positivity?
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously, I wouldn't wish it on anybody, right? Obviously, to lose a child, obviously, it's probably the hardest thing anyone could ever go through. For me, obviously, I had never arranged a funeral before. So obviously arranging a funeral for my son, obviously, was... a testing this experience emotionally, but more importantly, operationally. So I've got a large family in Ireland that all wanted to come over for the funeral, etc. And obviously, a lot of my family are back home in Ireland, where I'm originally from. So I didn't actually know how to arrange a funeral. And what was very kind of frustrating for me is obviously I'd spent 4 years of my career at Just Eat, for example, arranging, I was not arranging, but basically scaling a way to make pizza delivery or takeaway delivery easier. And it was literally easier to order a pizza than it is a funeral.
Yeah, 100%.
The actual ticket of a funeral is around about 10K now average. So for me, it was like, this is one of the most expensive things you're going to buy in your life. It's at the worst possible time in your life. And it's so opaque in terms of how you do it. So,
and it may, the person having to, sadly arrange it may just not have any experience of doing anything, let alone, scaling a business, for example, where you may have some understanding, okay, logistically, I've got to do X, Y, Z. I mean, not to turn it into, just a pure kind of business process issue, but it is one of the most emotionally challenging times of anybody's life. I mean, like in your life, clearly that would have been, even more immense than someone losing, say, a parent, after during their old age or whatever. But I think about all of this quite regularly because at the end of the day we're all getting older and stuff happens.
Yeah, it's a fact of life. I mean, obviously death is a taboo subject that people don't really want to confront and talk about. And unfortunately, when they do end up having to talk about it, it's during losing a person, right? So whether that's a loved one or a friend or whatever it may be, obviously practically in terms of when I arranged my son's funeral, it was basically a case of looking on Google for local funeral directors and ringing them up. And, obviously they're very busy. So obviously they couldn't actually see me for that day. They said I can come in, and I think it was the following day actually. So I waited like 2 days to get in there. When I went there, they basically slided over like a booklet, which is a bit like being at Pizza Express. Like, do you want to have this pizza or that pizza? And it was like, do you want this car or that car or these flowers or that flowers? Now, don't get me wrong. The funeral directors are very empathetic and they're great at what they do. It's a very localized business. So basically, it reminded me so much of Just Eat because you've got these local operators that obviously do a good job locally. But obviously, the price point and the opaqueness and, the lack of clarity in terms of, like for like comparison between providers when they're doing different products is very similar. So, I actually basically, not a lot of people know this, but I actually started a business as a kind of MVP called Perfect Funerals. And basically was an MVP to try and do a classic marketplace play to do a sort of, Just Eat at funerals essentially, underestimating how much of an ask that is for a consumer to actually use somebody for a funeral. When they don't know that company, there's no kind of NPS, there's no kind of Trustpilot reviews, etc. Being at such a high ticket price, and also it's such a sort of personal and important thing. You don't want to get it wrong, right? Obviously, if it's your parents' funeral or your child's funeral, whoever it is, and basically realised how hard it is to market that. So people don't care about it. I mean, we would actually do a bit of growth hacking on social media and stuff, and people would be like, the Grim Reapers followed me, this Perfect Funerals has followed me, like they chasing ambulances and all of that kind of thing. And this is just random people that was following on social media trying to get some following. So obviously, and then we went viral. We went in the BBC and the Daily Mirror, etc. And I was like, oh God, we need to be very careful with this because once you become a bit controversial in that space and do sort of guerrilla marketing, it's game over, right? Because obviously no one's going to look at you credibly. I mean, I think there's an insurance company that had an advert, billboard advert with Howard Shipman, the serial killer, saying that you should think about life insurance, and it got so much attention, obviously, and did probably exactly what they wanted to do in the demographics they was going after, but it's very niche, because a lot of people will be appalled by that and would never use them. So I was very, very careful to understand that obviously we needed to both innovate but also be very empathetic and actually maintain the trust that local funeral directors have. And basically, to cut a long story short, I actually abandoned the idea and actually went to Talixo. So obviously I realized that actually, maybe I'm biting off a bit more than I can chew here. The investor that I mentioned earlier that I actually went and had a conversation with, I was basically like, I think this is going to be a great space to actually disrupt because it needs the disruption. We want to make this easier for people, etc. And he was like, no, I totally agree with you, but I just think you need more experience on the C-levels before you can go and do this. And he was totally right. He was absolutely right in terms of I needed to actually increase my sort of leadership experience. So I left the idea. When I was at Talixo, it kept on eating away at me that obviously, that I need to do this.
It was something that you had to do,
For sure. So basically the reason for leaving Talixo was primarily because I wanted to go and do Sendoff. So I actually was wanting to do the actual same thing, but also thinking, okay, what could the attack vector be for me to actually go and get to the reputation that we need to then go and do the actual funeral piece. So we actually did a bit of experimentation to see what would work, and we actually decided on grave maintenance. there's a lot of people that actually can't get to a grave physically because they've moved away. So, you know, they might be living in Dubai or, you know, the UK or the US or wherever they live in. And, you know, it might be a very important anniversary for them, for their parents, or the date of the death of a relative or whoever it is. So what we could actually do is actually go to the grave, deliver flowers to the grave. We can clean the grave. We can provide grave maintenance services, etc. They get a before and after photo as well. So it's almost like they digitally visited the grave, but we're physically visiting it for
with
them.
Someone who has physically actually been there. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So that was kind of the kind of the bet that we basically would be able to get enough reputation in that space to then go and do the funeral piece. And what was really interesting is actually the investor that I went to for advice, that advised me to go to Talixo, etc. When I actually went back to him and said, look, I'm now doing Sendoff and obviously, you know, want to get some investment, he'd invested in the space. So actually invested in a company called Empathy, which is basically, I think their Series B now raised like 50 million.
Amazing.
So the space is kicking off now.
Yeah.
People are going into it. It doesn't sit right with me personally because obviously my whole purpose of going into the space was purpose-driven. From the bereavement of my son. I do think we're getting to the point now where there's going to be 2 MBAs and a laptop that's, you know, ex-consulting that go into it and know how to navigate the raising money, and that will cannibalize the industry and make it a worse industry. I definitely see that happening.
Well, they'll productize it, which is...
Definitely, but it's not an easy industry to scale anyway. So even if they'll be successful, it remains to be seen really. But I definitely feel that the industry's got legs. I think I was a little bit too early with Sendoff.
I think that, look, I mean, firstly, I can't even imagine, as I say, having to go through an experience like that. But equally, so what was really interesting to me was a few years ago, I had this sort of existential moment in my own life around the thoughts of my lover. I come from, again, a very, very, very big family, and I'm not religious. You know, I don't know what the proper, what the proper things to do are. So I actually had this thought at the time of building just a website, actually, which I was going to call deathrights.com or funeralrights.com or something along those lines, because, you know, I'm still closer to my religion and my practices than my kids are, and their kids are going to be even further away, right? Like, we can't in the same way that we've lost language, we've lost loads of things. Like, you know, obviously there are always going to be people that know what needs to be done, and there are people that you can, you know, go and talk to. But I think for someone like me, especially, like, having the comfort of having someone lead you through that end to end, that process, and being able to understand what is the right thing and who should I be talking to and when should I be talking to them, and, you know, what is the correct music that I need to play, or what is the right, you talked about graves, like we all, you know, in our kind of culture, it's cremation. So then, you know, with us also, it's about cremating and then scattering ashes into running water. Now you need permits to do that. There's all sorts of like complexities, right? And so I mean, I completely understand why you're doing it. It's one of the hardest topics for anyone to have to deal with. Obviously, currently in the news with the death rights bill and so on, that's been working its way through Parliament, etc. It's become more topical. I mean, that's the assisted dying bill, which is obviously a step further, right? But still incredibly sort of...
which is dangerous, right? I mean, obviously, if you look at it in terms of, you know, Canada, where it's obviously launched already, you know, you can get to a eugenics kind of level in terms of
abuse.
I mean, I think it's, I don't necessarily think it's intentional, but obviously, you know, if it's not well thought out, then obviously there's going to be, you know, sort of downsides to it as well that can have massive effects with people.
You're always going to have second order effects with this sort of stuff. I guess so. I mean, where are you with the business then? Are you still pushing it forward?
Yeah. So basically, it was interesting. So this kind of leads on to the Web Summit as well, right? So I was basically, you know, really thinking about pivoting. Obviously, the attack vector we went with was very niche. Grave tending and grave maintenance is something that's out there, but it's very local. And basically, you know, it's who do you market to, right? Because if you've got somebody who's living in New York that's looking after a grave in London, but obviously can't get to it, then how do you get them? And obviously, this is the challenge we've been having with Sendoff. Is obviously we've got users, but obviously the scale of it is not at a point where it's a nationally recognized brand. And obviously, we could then pivot into funeral marketplaces, which is what we want to do. So basically, I was at a point where, okay, what do I pivot to? And basically considering my options, basically. So the business is still active, so we've still got users, etc. It's all automated, so obviously I don't need to be on it hands day in, day out, really. So the business is still running. I am basically now entrepreneur residence at Web Summit, and actually didn't realize I needed to do that because basically the Web Summit thing came very organically for me. And I think I got to the point where, because obviously the startup for me is so important in terms of what it can be, and also the reason why I'm doing it.
The emotional connection, yeah.
I think obviously pivoting and maybe even abandoning the idea was not something that I found very easy, right? Because obviously I kind of felt mission driven. So obviously I needed to kind of revitalize myself to basically get the creative juices flowing again, and then basically go back and revisit it. So I'm actually with Web Summit for a year at the moment, basically on a year contract. Sendoff maybe something that I actually pivot in the later in this year or go into next year. But at the moment it's TBC. So obviously more will be revealed in that in the coming future.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, let's talk about Web Summit. You've raised it. So you are, as you say, entrepreneur in residency IR at Web Summit, which is the global technology conference. It's had its fair share of press in the last couple of years, which hopefully I will be able to ask Paddy about directly at some point. Must get that in the diary. But from your perspective, what is it that makes Web Summit, just such an important part of the startup and tech ecosystems calendar? It brings together over 70,000 participants from over 150 countries at the Lisbon event alone, and now you have global kind of expansion, which now includes events in Qatar, Brazil, Canada, Hong Kong, and presumably elsewhere in the future as well. So more importantly, I guess also as entrepreneur in residence, how are you looking to innovate and scale the offering and the company, and where does Web Summit go from here?
Sure. So I mean, answer to your question in terms of the reason why I joined Web Summit essentially, and what value does Web Summit present to people that attend or exhibit, etc. Web Summit is a unique proposition in the sense that it's an opportunity to cross-pollinate between Fortune 500 companies, executives from there, decision makers from there, more importantly, investors. So the who's who of VC and private equity will be there as well. Also startups themselves, obviously, that are brand new, and also the whole world of innovation. So you've got people from academia, research, etc. as well. So it's a melting pot. I just came back from CES in the States, and I had 120
That's
meetings.
A consumer electronics show,
which is kind of like the only thing that comes close to Web Summit, in my opinion, in terms of the tech world, but in the US. And basically, I had 120 meetings in 5 days. Obviously, it was insane, obviously, in terms of...
I think I was one of those meetings. You look pretty knackered.
No, definitely knackered. I mean, I covered like 120,000 steps during the week, which is like 57 miles. Yeah. And I don't think I've ever walked that in my life. So obviously, it was a busy old week. But basically, in comparison to kind of, Web Summit, I mean, it's an opportunity for people in a symbiotic way to come together and do business, basically. And I think in terms of Web Summit, if you want to go there to position yourself as a thought leader, as a speaker or as an executive from a company, it's that opportunity for people to do that. Obviously, in terms of partnerships, etc. as well, if you want to partner with other companies, etc. as well, you're probably not going to get any other opportunity to get people in the room with you at all, or even in terms of the volume, in terms of the number of meetings you can have, etc. as well. But just in terms of the experience, if you go to Web Summit and you're working in a startup, and startups are hard, right? Obviously, in terms of, or even scale ups, they're still hard as well. It's brutal. It's quite a lonely place. I mean, we've had the last few years where a lot of these consultants and tourist people have came into found companies and made it all glamorous, which is complete bollocks. Obviously, it's not glamorous in the slightest. It's very much,
sadly, if only it were. Yeah,
it's tough. I mean, you have to love it. You have to really love what you're doing, and you have to believe in what you're doing as well. And I think whereas a lot of people look at startups kind of a kind of just a business itself. It's not. It's more than a business, right? It has to be your life.
It's a life. I was going to say, for most, we talk about lifestyle businesses. For founders of high growth startups or those that are looking to build that sort of a business, that is the lifestyle.
Yeah. Not even just founders. I mean, I think even employees.
Exactly,
I mean, obviously, everyone in the company has to be really infected with the DNA of that mission.
Yeah.
In terms of, for me, I actually first went to Web Summit in 2017, which was pretty late in the day. I mean, obviously Web Summit had been going for quite a few years before that in Ireland, before it moved to Lisbon. And, you know, obviously I was speaking there in 2017 and, you know, didn't know the team, you know, obviously had no relationship with Web Summit whatsoever. And it was my first experience there, and it just reinvigorated my love of startups, obviously, in terms of being there for the few days that it was there. It's almost like a busman's holiday a little bit in the sense that obviously you're around a lot of kindred spirits. You know, Web Summit isn't just purely the event in the day and people exhibit in the day. There's also the night summit, etc. as well, where a lot of the magic happens. Obviously, people having a few beers, you know, a little bit, you know, in terms of the guards down, obviously, and a little bit more open to kind of, you know, sort of the sort of serendipity that happens at events. You know, so I think, you know, it's a way to kind of really, you know, kind of reinvigorate your love of startups. It's a way to, you know, to literally get, you know, a huge amount of work done within a few days as well. So I think in terms of the purpose it serves, it depends on what seat you're in. If you're an investor, you want to find the latest startups, you know, you want to find great investment opportunities, you're going to find that. You know, if you're a Fortune 500 company, you want to keep your finger to the pulse of innovation, what's coming next, you can do that as well. You know, if you're a media person that obviously wants to do lots of, you know, cool interviews with the top founders, etc., or podcaster, etc.,
that's me.
like you guys,
Hey.
you know, that is the great place for you to be as well. So
Yeah.
I think it ticks all the boxes. It's a one-stop shop for the ecosystem. It's an essential event for you to attend.
Yeah. I mean, I am hoping to be there this year. We will talk about that at some point, I'm sure, as well. And so where do you see it going? Like, what, as entrepreneur in residence, clearly, you know, I think about the EIR role as problem solving, you know, projects and problems, right?
Yeah.
Like, but also innovation, right? Like,
Yeah.
so essentially, you know, this is how we've done things. Okay, where should we be aiming to go from here? So, you know, give me a sketch of what you think the future holds for Web Summit.
I think Web Summit's only getting started. Genuinely, I think obviously we're stretching a lot across a lot of continents now. You know, the world is changing. I personally believe that the majority of the world is taken over completely. I think the West is finished now. My opinion, not Web Summit's opinion. I can't speak for them, but obviously the point is there, right? I mean, obviously you can see a lot of managed decline within the West. You know, obviously Web Summit is stretching across the world now, and I feel that, you know, innovation itself is going to continue. You know, there isn't going to be, you know, a break put on, you know, AI, or there's not going to be a break put on in terms of quantum computing. There's not going to be a break put on in terms of the change in dynamics of how people spend and earn their money. You know, I think the scale with Web Summit is huge at the minute, you know, in terms of the cities it's in. I mean, if you look at Lisbon, 70,000 attendees, you know, increasing every single year. The number of exhibitors is increasing. The quality of speakers is increasing as well. They're completely world-class speakers. And then where we've expanded to other cities like Rio de Janeiro, Vancouver, Qatar, Hong Kong, etc. as well. You know, there is other expansion coming as well. I'm not going to touch on that because it's not my place to, but obviously that's in the pipeline. In terms of the way that we really kind of cross-pollinate is obviously constantly changing as well. In terms of Night Summit in November just passed was a little bit different from previous years. And obviously I think it goes back to the roots of Web Summit, the DNA. Obviously I think, you know, you may have heard the stories of Bono and Elon Musk being on pub crawls in Dublin. And it's how do you maintain that at scale? You know, obviously, and I feel that's what Web Summit is really, really trying to get down to. I don't think people realize how data-driven Web Summit is as well in terms of actually the tangibles and the intangibles for exhibitors, etc. I mean, there's a lot of data that we can actually provide partners as well. So, I mean, I feel that, you know, the actual future for Web Summit is very much future-proof in terms of however the world changes. Web Summit is going to be at the forefront of it, and forefront of innovation.
I mean, the mere fact that it still exists. I mean, like, everyone thought the events industry was dead in 2020. You had Hopin, which, you know, conversely died itself.
Pump and dump.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I won't go into that. I know some of the people that were in there, but I mean, but the point is, you know. So I personally, I mean, this is why I do a podcast. Like, I believe that human to human relationships are the most important thing in life.
Yeah.
Certainly in business. And one of the ways of achieving that is by attending sort of events. And to your point, right? Like, opening yourself up to the serendipity. I mean, you know, in a much less sexier way, I used to, you know, when I lived out in Papua New Guinea, I used to go to the fairs, like the Guangzhou Fair in China, went to a couple of furniture fairs in Malaysia, Singapore, etc. And that was where I got to touch and feel the product, but also to meet the people, the suppliers, and also understand what was happening in the rest of the world, like where were trends going, what is the next sort of sexy design for a sofa, which sounds really sad, but that was kind of my life for a while. But that only happens when you're, in person. You're maybe sitting at a bar. I still remember sitting at a bar and chatting to this Spanish guy. I mean, I speak fluent Spanish, and just speaking to this Spanish guy for like, I don't know, a couple of hours. And we were just, we'd never met before, but we were just chatting about the differences in how, they were approaching the industry versus what we were doing. Right. So I completely buy into the fact that these sort of events aren't going anywhere. And I think Web Summit, to your point, not only already has attraction, but has the platform from which to continue to expand. And I think it's super interesting, your point around the digital and the data kind of side of things. Of course, right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, there's, there have been attempts to automate a lot of, kind of that matching and diarizing of meetings and so on, which is great. Don't get me wrong. And should throw out a lot of meaningful information. But again, I come back to, one of the benefits of these sort of things is literally just walking down the corridor, seeing someone, taking them to the side, saying, let's grab a coffee and having a chat.
Well, events are what you make them. I mean, obviously, if you go to an event with no plan, you're going to be like a headless chicken and a busy fool, right? So I think, the key is obviously that you need to take some accountability when you attend an event or an exhibit, an event or whatever it may be. But I think, for me, I don't do anything now that I don't believe in. And I think, Web Summit for me is a best-in-class company. It's got the potential to be the biggest event in the world, not just tech, in terms of any event out there, in terms of conferences, etc. It could be the best. In terms of the actual benefit to whoever's attending, whether they're an investor or an entrepreneur or a corporate exec or whatever they may be, or a journalist, etc. I feel that we need to offer the best experience, and we do in the events as well. Obviously we touched on how the matchmaking works, etc. in events as well. A lot of events have apps. No one uses the actual apps in most of the times. Obviously you can scan the badges and whatever as well. But obviously we've definitely got the best digital offering on the app side of things. Our technology is second to none, and I think that's just getting started, right? So I feel that the scope in terms of what Web Summit can do is huge. Part of, obviously, again, what drew me to the business is an Irish company. So its DNA is in Ireland, started there, and obviously our head office is there as well.
You got a founder called Paddy, so a long time.
Bit stereotypical there, right? No, I mean, obviously I'm from Ireland, so obviously it's phenomenal. I don't think that Web Summit gets the credit it deserves in terms of the job it's done so far. Obviously, it's not easy to run an event in terms of the moving pieces in an event, and in terms of scaling it to other cities and continents, it's even harder, right? So I think the work that's done so far is amazing, and where our values align is obviously, I've got a 1% mentality myself in my career. I think Web Summit has definitely got that as well. It's a humility to Web Summit. It doesn't kind of shout from rooftops about how great it is. It just wants to do and execute, and I think that's definitely something that attracts me to the company.
Yeah, amazing. I'm going to move on. I mean, I think Web Summit, I look forward to seeing its growth over the coming years, and like I say, interacting with you and participating in some way or the other in the future. But we have one sort of topic that I wanted to talk to you about, because I mean, one of the interesting things, like you and I kind of connected on Twitter over some random kind of posts that either one of us had put out. I can't remember at this point, and we found kind of quite a fair amount of common ground in terms of how we think about the ecosystem. And you and I have talked about venture capital, and you've used the phrase venture colonialism, which is something that I would describe as the fact that we're seeing extractive practices, a homogenization of the culture, despite attempts by every VC to be different. We're seeing concentration of power, possibly abuse of some of that power, and a lack of accountability. So what do you think has caused that evolution, or even devolution, I guess, in the venture market? And what do you think the future holds and looks like for venture in an ever more competitive market? Like where are we going?
So I think, obviously, being philosophical, right? I mean, obviously, for me, the allegory of the cave is alive and kicking. You know, obviously, the world is rigged, first and foremost. I mean, obviously, everything that we see and everyone kind of zooms into in terms of sound bites. I mean, obviously, the inauguration and Elon Musk and Trump and all the rest of it, it's just pantomime. You know, it's just basically, you know, I think it's termed the generative principle of care. Basically, people get, you know, lost in these kind of, you know, sound bites and Hegelian dialectic. You know, it's just nonsense, right? And I think, you know, if you look at things pragmatically, the world is what you make it. Obviously, you need to understand how things work to kind of navigate it as best as you can, really. And you know, in terms of finance and capital distribution, I feel that that's very much rigged. Obviously, in terms of who gets the access to VC, who get access to private equity, etc. But what it boils down to is actually the world isn't optimized for independence. No. You know, obviously, if you're going to basically be a startup that's a runaway train that goes on to kind of be a unicorn single-handedly, you know, it's not very good for the powers that be to kind of see that, and obviously creates a precedent for other companies to think, okay, we don't need venture capital. Or, you know, if you're going to do it the other way and you do get quite far, if VC doesn't cash it on the way up, PE will later on, right? So obviously, I think really what it boils down to is control. You know, obviously the financial system is to serve to control the kind of objectives and the agendas around obviously where the world goes. In terms of you know at a country level with the likes of IMF and World Bank, etc., they control, you know, obviously the kind of objectives for a country. And I think in terms of venture capital and PE, they do it for a corporate or for a startup, really. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Obviously, it's just is what it is. It's the way things work. But I think where I mentioned the term venture colonialism is it basically aligns with the kind of overall objectives of the world where that's heading, right? So if you look at where we're at now, obviously, you know, I think climate change is becoming a big issue now that's being focused on as well. That isn't new. That was focused on in 1992 at the Rio conference, right? Obviously, that was decided then. Obviously, that was going to be a huge objective. So I think these issues, although they seem like they've just came from nowhere, a lot of decisions has been made to kind of be...
Someone is driving an agenda somewhere.
Yeah, and let's not get all kind of conspiracy theorist about it. Obviously, you know, obviously the world needs some order in terms of where it's going to head. You know, I think what tends to happen is, in my own personal view, is I feel that, you know, that actual rationale is sometimes flawed. Obviously, you know, you can go and buy kind of consensus from credible scientific people about anything if you've got the right kind of influence and also finance, really. So I think you know, I like to kind of, you know, not really kind of listen to the crowd and also think quite contrarian. So I think, you know, what I feel that is wrong with venture capital is that, you know, it's very reactive. So you see a space every couple of years that obviously is the hot space. So, you know, scooters is a perfect example, right? You know, if you walk down this high street, obviously there's going to be tons of scooters that's lined up and no one's using them, right? The utilization is practically zero.
Or my favorite one, which, you know, long-time listeners to the podcast will both know and hate me for saying, but like 15-minute grocery delivery was like the hot thing for like a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know people that worked in that space, and I don't think there's anything wrong with those spaces, right? But I think the conviction that obviously the venture capital did with throwing money at these spaces, obviously just because it's kind of FOMO driven, is phenomenally kind of stupid.
Yeah, it's actually net destructive to those industries, because if there was a more thoughtful kind of way of building out those sort of businesses, you may have seen different outcomes.
Yeah, right? Definitely. I mean, you know, I think with my track record, you know, you'd assume that I'd basically be able to rock up to a tier 1 VC and be able to raise a Series A or a large sort of seed round, which isn't the case. But however, you know, if somebody who's ex McKinsey or ex BCG rocks up and basically just says, okay, AI, you know, they're going to get what they want, really. So I think that's where I think obviously the kind of the lack of you know, sensibleness is in terms of VC, in that they actually just basically chase the latest space and look at all this bullshit signal around education, etc., and not necessarily can these people deliver a lot of the time as well. In terms of, you know, the colonialism piece, I think it aligns with the kind of global goals that are happening at the time. So I feel that, you know, the distribution of capital is never going to be fair. Yep. It's never going to be fair. Obviously, there's going to be a disparity in terms of who receives VC. And I think that's just something we have to deal with. I think we can't moan about it. It just has to be something that we have to, you know, get on with, really. In terms of the, you know, the actual colonialism word. I don't think VCs are trying to be colonialist. But I mean, it really boils down to that, right? Is obviously if you're only basically investing in a certain demographic, maybe education based or class based or whatever it may be, then I think there's definitely a them and us kind of culture really in terms of who can actually get VC. And look, VC is just ingredients, right? You still have to bake the cake. So I don't think obviously that it's the be all and end all. Obviously I think there's still ways to go other routes, but it's a lot harder. It's a steeper hill to climb. I think if I could go and raise 10 million tomorrow for a startup, I'd be able to do a lot of a more aggressive kind of trajectory in terms of growth than I would having to bootstrap. And I don't think bootstrap is a bad thing. I think we're in the era of bootstrap now, and I'm cut from that cloth. Just Eat was bootstrapped initially, so I think I think the importance of VC is obviously becoming less so at the minute, because basically there isn't as much now, right? And a lot of funds are closing. There's a lot of zombie funds now that obviously are maybe hiding the fact.
There's a lot of emerging managers that are struggling to raise or have basically decided to stop their fundraising activities because it is not an easy market out there. And 2024, to be honest, I think was brutal across all categories.
But I'm happy about that. I think it's actually it's a correction that needed to happen. Yeah. Obviously, there was a lot of arrogance within the VC world. Obviously, some of it justified. Obviously, some of them had done some phenomenal exits and obviously done a great job. But there was a lot of people that had not done anything and obviously just basically kind of coattailed, rid the coattails of other funds, etc. Obviously, that wasn't doing anything special. So I think the correction needed to happen. I think what I would like to see now is obviously as the kind of industry evolves, a bit more humility. Obviously, you see these funds on LinkedIn. Don't contact me like this, do contact me like this, and they've not done an investment for 3 years, right? So I think the kind of the hype is over now for them, and I think they just need to look at obviously who can actually execute and the spaces that are actually going to pick up. I mean, I mentioned the end of life industry. That's a $20 billion industry in the US alone. Obviously that's before you get started in Europe, Canada, China, etc. as well. So it's a huge industry. There's nobody that's actually disrupted the actual space in terms of a marketplace. It's the last consumer space, in my opinion, that's actually left. Why wouldn't people be thrown at that space, money at that space? But they're not, because they don't understand it. And VCs never get into the depth of actually understanding.
Well, it's also not sexy, right? Like I think that's the other thing. I mean, it is a lot easier to pitch an AI startup, right, for example, than it is to pitch, well, we're going to look after your mother's grave. Like that's just the reality of some of the hype cycles that VCs go through, or some of the hype cycles that sadly a lot of VCs go through. I think, the best VCs are thoughtful about each and every space that they go into in very different ways. But exactly to your point, there are only a handful of those really great VCs out there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially in Europe. I mean, in the US, I think it's a different kettle of fish. I think there's a lot of VCs that have realized, obviously, that, you can't basically just say an automatic no, right? Because obviously you missed out on this or that other startup, right? So I think your point on not sexy is very relevant, but I think that's changing now, right? We're in an era where we're in an economic downturn, which isn't going away. This is going to be for the next 10 to 15 years.
Often it is the least sexy businesses that are the most powerful and profitable as well.
Definitely,
future,
yeah.
right? So,
I mean, and also, it's not just about obviously the kind of optics of that space as well, but also, the due diligence that goes into these kind of investments they're making. I mean, you mentioned AI. A lot of the time, it's just a UX layer over ChatGPT. I mean, it's not anything significantly special, and it's not got any legs. So I think, for me, the interesting piece is, I mean, if you look at Talixo, where I was at previously, they were, obviously not good enough for Series B funds a couple of years ago. They won't start ringing now because obviously they've got good revenue. It's a solid business. They're efficient, solid partnerships and diversified. So obviously, it's a different.
There's an opportunity to return capital to LPs if you invest, right?
And also, look, not every company needs to be $1 billion exit, right? Obviously, and I know, appreciate in terms of the economics, the way funds are structured, that it needs to be certain times if they're going to invest significantly. But I mean, I think in terms of, seed funds, for example, there's no shame in, sort of, 100 million exit, obviously if it's a quick one and obviously they've put in X amount of money, right? So I think obviously definitely for Series A and above, obviously they need to have the big home runs, right? But obviously they're very few and far between. I personally think if there was a lot more humility in the space, that a lot more outliers would be discovered, because I think, you really need people that understand the problems and people that actually live and breathe the startup and obviously, obviously really get what they're trying to solve. I think a lot of the time people are trying to solve problems that don't exist.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is the classic it is the reality of what has happened over the course of the last 5, 6, 7 years, which is people have gone product first. So solution first, problem second, right?
Yeah.
Whereas actually what they should have been doing, and I was guilty of this 100% myself. I built a solution to a problem that I thought existed, but actually when I went out there, realized that actually that problem does not exist in the way that I thought it did, or certainly could not be monetized in the way that I thought it did. And I think in a world where it is that much easier to spin up a product, actually it gives founders the ability to test and iterate like a hell of a lot quicker than they were in the past. And this is one of the reasons I think we're seeing, we're not seeing as much volume going into kind of B2B SaaS startups, because quite frankly, they can get quite far on limited capital. And therefore you don't need necessarily 10 million Series A's to take a software business or a SaaS business, into scale. You can do that with revenue-based financing or self-financing or whatever it might be, right? But
also the B2B SaaS plays are actually getting a lot of pushback now, right? Because obviously, whereas people let the kind of the cost run and not think about it, CFOs like yourself,
it's like, why are we using these 30 different products to do the same function? I mean, exactly, look, I think I've mentioned on this podcast before, and this was like sort of a few years ago, one of the CFOs that I know, I was catching up with him, and he was like, we're spending $250,000 a year on Monday.com.
Yeah.
I've got no idea whether anyone's using it. Yeah. But it's just like, it's a line item at the moment. I need to get to it. I need to investigate, but I got all this other stuff to look at. But you can bet your bottom dollar, they're paying for a huge number of licenses, and probably only a handful of people are really, really using it, right? Yeah. So no, look, I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I think we're seeing an inflection point in venture at the moment. Interesting as we've had Fred Destin on the podcast before. Yeah. He posted something. I haven't actually read the post properly, but I think they've just made their last investment out of the Ultimate Stride Fund.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
And he's being very thoughtful about what he does next, and let's see what happens there. But I think we're going to see a lot more of those sort of posts.
I don't think we will, actually. I think he's one of the few honest guys in VC, right? I think a lot of people don't tell it as it is and just allude to they're actually still investing when they're not.
Yeah, so less about the honesty, but okay, so maybe what I mean is we're going to see more silent closures or whatever, right? So in the sense that, okay, Fred has been very vocal about what he's chosen to do and how he's chosen to do it. Others won't be as vocal, but it will still happen, I think is the point.
Definitely, yeah.
I want to close off with a question I'll ask everyone. I've got a feeling you're going to have a doozy here, but what is one contrarian conviction that you have about any area of life, whether that's work, politics, socially, or at home? What's kind of the hill that you would die on defending?
Could you give me a bit of inspiration here? Because obviously that's quite a broad question, isn't it?
I mean, look, so if I'm honest, we've been asking this question over the last sort of 3 or 4 months, and I've had everything. So my last guest, his contrarian opinion was we do not need to be sending humans to Mars, which actually pretty sensible a contrarian opinion. I think others, the reason this is such a difficult question is because it's very easy to be contrarian. It's very hard to be contrarian and right and meaningfully contrarian, right? Like there's performative contrarianism. I have accepted no answer in the past, and I'm more than happy for you to do that. But I mean, I think you've voiced a bunch of contrarian opinions already in the podcast, right? Like definitely that would go against the grain of most people's thinking or many people's thinking.
I don't think people think though. I think most people are intelligent, but I think most people are kind of programmed or conditioned into what they say. So I think if there's anything that I'd say in answer to that question would be that intelligence is nothing without consciousness, right? I think a lot of people are operating at very low levels of consciousness. They assume they're thinking, but they're not, and they're basically influenced by whoever, and they're just repeating and regurgitating what's ever said. I think we've all been there. I mean, obviously, during the pandemic, during different things that's happened over the last few years, I think we've all voiced and said things. I think we're all learning as we go along. I think we've become a very sensitive world where people can't voice things without it being taken or misinterpreted into another thing that it's not. And also there's people that are very Machiavellian and obviously play on this. I mean, we mentioned before about Elon Musk and things he's up to over the last few days. And I think, people zoom into these characters characters and, you know, have such a strong opinion, and what they don't realize is they're being played, right? Obviously, they're just basically being the free marketeers or data entry on social media, unpaid for these guys, right? So I think for me, I think if people, and I've only learned this myself recently, I'm a work in progress myself. I think you need to just zoom out of everything. You can't control what you can't control, and if you do try to, it's a very miserable place to be. So I think you need to just basically uplift yourself and just zoom out of what you can't control, and you know, really work on your own knowledge of self and seeing the world for what it is and not what it is perceived to be.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I would agree with all of that. I think it is quite contrarian in today's world, given what people actually do. I think most people would probably agree with you and then go and actually do the exact opposite. And I think that's the kind of point that you're alluding to. I remember, you know, several years ago making the decision that I was not going to read the news every day, right? Like the way I frame it is, I need to know what's happening, but I don't need to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I need to know the broad picture, but actually I don't need to know the detail of every single conversation about everything that's happening. Look, this has been an incredibly inspiring and just honestly enjoyable conversation. Henry, for our audience, where can they find you online? Are you on LinkedIn, Twitter? Where's the best place for them?
Henry Joseph Grant on LinkedIn, Sperrine on Twitter, receptive on both of those.
Amazing. Well, look, Henry, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.